we're here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's May 12th here in Seoul. I'm Shin-Yoon, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Choi Ji-hee.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Niall Song.
Hi, everyone.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Now, both are here to speak on behalf of those in their 20s and 30s. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. Now, pets usually refer to animals that stay by our side and keep us company, but here in Korea, there's a thing called pet beaches, which refer to preserving and taking care of our natural seashores. Now, this type of program originated from Texas in the US back in the 80s, and Korea's Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries benchmarked this environmental campaign in 2020. Since then, 13 companies and organizations have been cleaning up 8 beaches on Jeju Island, and officials are aiming to expand the number of pet beach owners to at least 16 by the end of this year. Next up, a teen has been arrested for forcibly drawing tattoos on his fellow middle school classmates. One victim had a 22-centimeter long carp drawn onto his thigh at a motel room last October, and this victim claimed that he had been bullied and robbed for 2 years, so he felt like he had no choice but to submit to the assailant's demands. Police also received a separate complaint from the parents of another student who claimed that he was also forced into getting a devil tattooed onto his chest. Moving on, this year we've seen a lot of earthquakes hit Donghae City in Gangwon-do Province. The latest earthquake struck Wednesday with a magnitude of 2.5. Now, the Korean Meteorological Administration said as of this year, this region has seen 13 earthquakes with magnitudes of at least 2.0, including all slight tremors. Donghae City has witnessed a total of 42 small quakes. Now, we're going to take a closer look at the third news items. Now, experts said it's really hard to accurately predict earthquakes, but they've said history shows that earthquake clusters are precursors to bigger quakes. For instance, back in 2016, we had an earthquake with a magnitude of nearly 6 hit Gyeongju. Also, the latest earthquakes have been happening near deep parts of the sea, which is also a common thing we see before large-scale quakes. Now, after hearing all of this, how worried are you now?
Man, I mean, first of all, I just really hope genuinely that everyone's okay in the Gangwon province. I've personally experienced several earthquakes, some in Morocco and some in Pohang, several years back.
Yes.
Damage is huge, and it's not just, collateral damage, it's also just emotional and it could be traumatic. So I really do hope that we are prepared, whether it be, building structures or educating people and knowing what to do, taking the right safety measures for whatever is to come. Because like you just mentioned, experts are saying we can't predict it perfectly every time. So we need to be always prepared for the worst.
It's always best to be prepared. And I remember growing up in the States, we had earthquake drills.
Yeah.
From elementary school, we would learn what to do in case an earthquake breaks out. And I hope that type of education is implemented here in the country. But Ji-hee, what about you? How worried were you when you heard this news?
Well, we've been seeing little earthquakes in the country. We haven't seen them a lot in the past, but because of these frequent earthquakes, we are worried, and it's very natural to be worried. But experts do say that certain changes in earthquake trends have been observed in the Korean Peninsula, but it's too early to worry about any further disasters because earthquake swarms are relatively small earthquakes that are within a small area or short period. They don't have, in the past, if you take a look at the past, they haven't always led to a huge earthquake before. So for example, in 2013, there were some 60 earthquakes. And in 2020, there were some 70 earthquakes in Boryong and Haenam, respectively. But these swarms did not lead to large earthquakes back then. Also, according to experts, the fault responsible for the recent earthquakes, they're not major faults compared to other earthquakes. So this also alleviates the concern over impending disasters.
And thanks to you, I can sleep comfortably at night, I think. Because I was really worried when I saw this. Good to know for sure. All right, that was our news feed for this Friday. Now we're going to move on to our main discussion. And recently, jeonse fraud has been a big issue in Korea, especially since it has taken the lives of innocent people in their 20s and 30s. Take a look at the screen to find out more. It's bad enough that it's close to impossible to land your own apartment in Korea. But can you imagine losing everything, including what you've borrowed from the bank, even before stepping foot in your new property? That's what happened to hundreds of victims of the latest jeonse scams. jeonse is a Korean real estate system where tenants pay a large upfront deposit known as key money, which is often several $100,000. The landlord can make money off the interest from this deposit rather than charging a monthly rent. The key money deposit is then returned at the end of the rental agreement, usually lasting 2 years. But in the latest scams, tenants were unable to reclaim their housing deposits. Today, NewsGen aims to answer 3 questions. 1. Why are those in their 20s and 30s considered the most vulnerable to jeonse scams? 2. How are South Korean officials trying to prevent these frauds from happening again? 3. What are some suggestions Millennials and Gen Z have on this matter? Today we're going to be talking about jeonse scams in Korea, and as we just saw, most of the victims who took their own lives were in their 20s and 30s. Now, before we go on to talk about why young people are susceptible to this type of scam, Ji-hee, why don't you tell us what jeonse is?
Well, the jeonse system is a housing rental system that's very unique to Korea. So I'm sure people living abroad, they may find it quite strange and maybe unfamiliar with it. Well, if you take a look at the screen, instead of paying monthly rent to a landlord, you pay a large lump sum deposit for the duration of a contract. It's really an intermediary scheme that basically sits between monthly installments and ownership of a housing. And the deposit is usually around 70% of the property's market value and is refunded to the tenant after the contract period, which is by law 2 years long. And the tenant can also choose to renew the contract for one further 2-year period, so you can be living in the same house for 4 years, really. But while the system is supposed to be fully refunded to the tenant after the contract period, because scammers buy these houses without any funds through a series of jeonse contracts, the tenants in the end weren't able to get their lump sum money back. And these are usually young people who've just begun working or have just gotten a job. They don't have much money, but they're unable to get this back. This is why we've seen this tragedy going on recently.
Right. And I mean, this whole idea of jeonse, when I mention it to my foreign friends who aren't living in Korea, are so confused. They're like, so why do they get the money back? But you mentioned in the VCR that, you know, it's for the landlord to maybe make an investment in bank or maybe some other real estate properties, and, you know, it could be stocks or whatever they're doing with the interest. But what we mentioned just now is that some people can't get the money back because either, you know, the investment kind of went really badly, and those cases are, you know, just unfortunate and it happens, but also there are intentional scammers who are out there trying to trick people and, you know, just having no intention to return that money whatsoever from the beginning. But just so you know, for everybody out there who's listening, in Korea, we do have other systems as well. You know, the monthly payment for rent, and you can also purchase a house.
Yeah, though it's very hard, as we talked about in prior
extremely
discussions.
difficult.
For sure. But as you guys mentioned, jeonse is a strictly Korean concept in real estate. But that's why a lot of people thought it was relatively less risky because it's better than the monthly paying. But now that we're seeing so many scammers out there, some are even calling for the jeonse system to be scrapped as a whole. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think eventually it should be scrapped because we've been seeing how ineffective this is, the whole system. And investing with that lump sum money for the landlords, I mean, it's just unfair when some people are getting scammed and ending their lives even. So I think what's a good option could be the 반전세 or quasi-jeonse, where the lump sum money, the amount of it is lower, but you at the same time also pay the monthly rent, which is also lower. But recently in Korea, in the first quarter of this year, I heard that statistics show that many people were looking for monthly rents a lot more. So there were over like 1,000 cases where the monthly pay is even over 1 million Korean won, which is not cheap, right?
It's not cheap.
But people are still choosing to get monthly rents because it seems safer, because at least they don't have to get involved in any sort of scam.
For sure. What about you now?
Yeah, I mean, just I've mostly lived paying rent my entire life, you know, growing up abroad in US, Canada, Morocco, Kenya, like everywhere I went, it was rent, and that was the norm. But coming back to Korea, I can see why jeonse is kind of an attractive option, because I'm actually thinking about moving quite soon as well, but it's so, you know, expensive to buy a house. I'm not ready for that just yet. And, you know, paying rent, the idea of that to Koreans is, oh, why would you, you know, waste money on rent when you can have jeonse and you can get the money back.
Right.
So
Right.
that's what makes it so attractive.
For sure.
But you know, there's so many different ways that you can get scammed these days, and it's so scary. And I've looked into some other countries, and Sweden actually has something kind of similar to the whole jeonse system, and it's called Bostadstrat. I'm so sorry to all the Swedish listeners out there, but you know, it's mostly the system is
Right.
kind of like an association of people, and you go into it and you pay a certain amount, but you keep the house not for 4 years or 2 years, but for as long as you want, as long as you're staying in the association.
Oh.
And this is mostly for the purpose of housing rather than, you know, making profit, which is why
Interesting.
people,
Right.
there's so much drama going on in there.
Right, and though it might be very difficult to get rid of this years-long real estate tradition, I think we need to see more measures happen because just yesterday we saw the 4th victim of jeonse fraud. You know, we're not sure if she took her own life yet, but she was found dead in her property. So officials have been convening to find better protection and regulation matters for jeonse fraud victims, and they're even trying to enact a special law. So Chihi, why don't you explain to us what this law is and what people are saying about it?
Right, so the government announced it will support the victims of these scams through a special law that will be temporarily applied for 2 years only. And if you are recognized as a victim under this law, and if your housing is auctioned off, for example, you get the priority over the right to purchase that housing.
Okay.
But if the tenant chooses not to purchase the housing, then the government can buy it first and lease it to the tenant. So that's another option. And there are 6 different requirements to be recognized, yes,
Okay.
as a victim under this law. But people say that it's too strict, and they're also complaining that it's maybe not helping them as much, and just by the fact that our tax money has to be put into the support towards these victims is something that some people are opposing as well.
And speaking on behalf of the victims, they've already been through so much. I mean,
know.
for you to qualify for all
Yeah.
those 6 different things in order to be considered a victim, that might be too cumbersome for sure.
Right.
And that's why I hear some tenants have actively been looking for ways to, you know, better screen which houses and properties or even landlords are safe enough, right?
Right.
Tell us more on that.
You gotta love the internet and the internet community. They've actually gathered a lot of people, and there's these websites. Loosely translated is kind of like I don't know, badhomeowner.com
that's
or
good
something like that.
translation,
And
yeah.
you just kind of talk about like the real estate market and what kind of people are out there. Don't go to this owner
Right.
because you might end up getting, you know, I don't know, treated
Scammed
poorly
or- yeah.
or scammed and things like that. But, you know, I think that real estate agents need to be held a little more responsible as well. And we were discussing this earlier before the show, that if the real estate agent actually has an understanding of the homeowner who wants to rent out their houses, whether it be jeonse or 월세, and they have, you know, this certain amount of trust, it would be easier for them to, you know, just kind of put it out there safely without people getting scammed. And there definitely needs to be a more official process to screen all of that. And if it, you know, goes poorly, I think they need to be held a little responsible for that as well.
For sure, and officials are actually trying to help all those people who are actually trying to go through jeonse. They've even like launched an app, an online app where you can look through all the safe, incredible landowners. But people are saying there still needs to be more done.
Yes.
And we're now going to hear from an actual attorney on what to do to prevent or even address jeonse scams even better. We're now going to connect to an attorney in Korea who will give us legal counseling on how to prevent and address jeonse scams. It's Yoongi Hwang. Welcome, Yoongi.
Good morning.
All right, so as you've been listening to our discussion, the Korean government seems to be strengthening and has actually pledged to further strengthen regulations to prevent jeonse fraud. But before you explain how they're doing so, can you first explain to us how jeonse scams work and what are the measures taken to be implemented soon to help victims of jeonse fraudsters?
Right. So I've been listening to your discussions, and you actually got a lot of the points right. So which leaves me with very little to say. But to explain how jeonse scams work, as with all scams, there are criminals can get very creative, as we all know.
Right.
So there are just so many possibilities. First is just outright fraud and misrepresentation. So we could have a case where somebody pretends to be an agent of the landlord. So they come to you, the tenant, and say, sign an agreement with me. I know the landlord, I'm doing everything on his behalf, but it turns out he's not. So all your jeonse money goes to somebody else.
Oh, no.
Or we could have multiple rental agreements on the same house. So they write overlapping agreements. So you also get to live here in the house, you get to live here in the house, and we just have a whole mess of what situation. So those would be just frauds. They were out to commit a crime from the onset. The second case would be, as you mentioned, where the value of the real estate, the market value, falls below what the jeonse price was. So the loan to value of the house goes lower than expected, which means it complicates legal relationships and becomes really difficult to recover the value of the jeonse because the market price has fallen. So even if you sell it off in an auction, that sum will not be enough to cover the amount.
I see. Then what are the policies that the government has been trying to implement then?
Right. So you mentioned the special law. The law, we call it a special act, but it's not very special per se, but it applies to a very specific case. So you mentioned that very well. So you have to qualify for certain conditions. If you fill those 6 conditions, they will provide you with the right to purchase the house that was foreclosed, or the landing house corporation could come in with public funds, just purchase the house and convert the house that was the subject of the jeonse scam to a public housing, which will be provided to you at a much more affordable rate.
Right.
Well,
Yes.
sorry, we've mentioned in our discussion earlier that this special act doesn't really seem that special, like you
Right.
said, and people think it's not going to be that effective. But do you think these policies will be effective, and what still should be tackled?
So one of the factors that I was going to mention is harsher punishments. So there's going to be more stringent investigations to possible perpetrators of the crime. I don't know, there hasn't been anybody indicted yet, but the prosecutor's office is planning to impose much harsher charges, much more higher sentencing than typical fraud. So it remains to be seen how that is going to deter people from committing fraud. And what should be tackled? And as you also mentioned, there are people who say we should abolish the system altogether. This just has no place in society anymore. But I'd have to say that jeonse does have its benefits because Seoul is a global city, and compared to other global cities like New York, San Francisco, London, Hong Kong, in Asia, rent prices in those cities are exorbitantly high. So people spend something like, I don't know, like 40, 50% of their income only on rents. And jeonse brings down that ratio to, I don't know, much lower ratio. So I do see the benefits in jeonse. But what should be tackled? I think, so if you take a really close look at jeonse, it's a private financial scheme, really. So instead of borrowing from the bank, the landlord is borrowing from the tenant. And as we all know, when we go to a bank and we try to ask for money, they ask you for a lot of documents. They call that customer due diligence and know your customer and all sorts of just red tape and regulation. So I think the jeonse system could be complemented by a much more stringent due diligence process. That would be much more beneficial. Yes.
I actually have a question. This is coming from a personal place. I am so scared. I need to move out of my house soon. But like you said, jeonse does have its benefits. So what are some ways that I can prevent getting scammed? And what would be the best way to go about this?
So there are the regular steps that you have to take, which is check the deed. Be very careful. Go to the registrar's office, see if there's any mortgages, any liens on the property, any claims on the property, make sure. And then we call it 전입신고, register your address with the local office, certify the date of the lease agreement. So those are all steps that you can take to be cautious.
I see.
But I guess the more fundamental advice would be to find someone you can really trust.
Yeah.
So if the real estate agent begins to mince their words, you ask them something, hoping for an honest answer, but they don't give you one. They're like, oh, no, there's this and there's that, and blah, whatever's going on. As long as your agent does that, I think you just walk away. Because Seoul's a big city. There are tens and millions of housing, so you can always find a better place.
For sure.
That's such good advice.
It's great advice. It's simple advice, but it's so hard at the same time.
I know.
That's why it's so hard to alleviate this jeonse phobia, but we'll see what type of measures come in the future. Thank you so much, Yoongi.
Thank you.
All right, we're now going to hear from our global viewers, and we asked them about whether they've actually fallen victim to any type of scams before. So take a look at the screen. Tira Spell says housing scams are relatively uncommon here, but there are other scams here that are more prevalent. The most notable example being the Amazon scam, where the victim's assets are stolen under the guise of getting a refund. Now, Hussein Demir said, I have not been scammed yet, but know of a family moving to the US who are almost scammed. Luckily, they delayed their payment and found out it was a scam after coming here. It's not common for the residents here, but it might be for people moving from abroad. Dwight Anderson said, I haven't been scammed, but having to pay off my mortgage for the next 30 years is such a big burden. So based on what our viewers are saying in our discussion and talks with Yoongi, jeonse phobia or any type of scam does cause a lot of fear amongst us.
Yeah.
So I think it's now time for us to wrap up and think of realistic ways to stop these scams as a whole. And in order for us to do that, we should be listening to young people who are the most vulnerable to it.
Exactly.
So any ideas you guys have?
Well, after listening to what Yoongi said, we should really find the person we can trust.
Yes.
And I was kind of persuaded by him, the fact that jeonse also has its benefits.
There are merits
Right,
for sure.
right. So the government should really complement the flaws that we've seen so
Right.
far. And at the same time, I wish there were more affordable government-run housings that can be
Yes.
provided to the young people who do not have enough lump sum money for the jeonse, or not that, I don't know, they're very vulnerable to these scams, right? So systems that can protect them this way should be implemented by the government.
And you're moving out soon, so
Yes, I am.
this topic is personally
Applies to
very
me.
connected to you.
Yes.
Any suggestions you have on this front?
I mean, it was very heartfelt what he said. It's hard, but he said find somebody that you can trust. And I think the government needs to work closely with real estate agents and real estate, different people. And yeah, just keep them accountable. Make sure that they are trustworthy. That
Place
we
a
don't
check on them too.
Yeah, check on them so we don't have to go around checking every single real estate agent on whether they're trustworthy or not.
Right, providing better information so that, we can just live comfortably. It's
Yeah.
so hard to live these days, so
I know.
might as well. All right, and we'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Choi Ji-hee.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you. And Niall Song.
Happy Friday.
All right, and thank you everyone for watching. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. We are
News Generation.